Good morning or good afternoon. Hi, I am Nika Sewell-Smith here with Ancestry. I'm a senior story producer here. You may have seen me on a number of different things, maybe in your social feeds, on videos talking about researching your African American family history, or maybe this is not the first time you have seen me here in this particular space in our education and virtual classes and events series. I'm so glad that you all are joining me today to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is the Freedmen's Bureau. Definitely let us know where you're checking in. Some of you are already fully well versed on how I do this. So you're already putting your cities and locations in. People here from North Carolina and Texas, Oklahoma City, Hilton Head, South Carolina, Minnesota, which is great because I have a ton of family there. Again, I'm so glad that you all can join me for this session today. Now, just want to remind you at the onset, if you're watching the recording, you be sure, remember, you can always go back and rewind. So if there's something that I said, you can do that at your leisure. If you're here live, be sure to utilize the chat to interact with the folks who are here live with you, as well as I have some incredible support from my team at Ancestry, who is here to help support and answer questions that arise in the chat as the session is happening live. As well, if you're watching the recording, be sure to go in and comment if you still have questions, if you make finds within the Freedmen's Bureau, maybe if it helped you to get through a brick wall. We love to hear that. So make sure that you go in and comment. And as well as if you know someone who is not able to join the live session or who is interested in this topic but is not able to join live, be sure to share the link to the recording. So then that way they are able to learn as much as you have been able to learn and absorb today. All right, so we've got a lot to get to. And of course, the way that I do this, I have slides because I always want to make sure that I contextualize everything and so that you're clear. I'm a visual learner. I don't know who else is in this space. So if you're a visual learner like I am, I like to have something tangible for me to be able to read as well as hear. So we're doing that. Ooh, someone from Temecula. I love that. I am from Moreno Valley, California. So that's right, not too far from Temecula. All right, you all. So let's talk about the Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen's Bureau created some of the most valuable records for tracing African American history during and after the Civil War, documenting everything from labor contracts and marriages to family reunification efforts and military service. In this session, you're going to learn how to effectively search and interpret these powerful records on Ancestry, turning what might seem like an overwhelming historical document into meaningful stories about your ancestors' resilience and determination. And whether you're just beginning your research or potentially if you've hit a brick wall, these records could hold the key that will help you unlock your family's Reconstruction era story. So you are here with me, joining me live or either watching the recording for navigating the Freedmen's Bureau records on Ancestry. All right, so let's get started. First things first. If you ever, sit in with a session with me, we always start with questions. Okay. So let's ground our conversation for today or tonight or whenever you're watching this. Okay. The first thing we have to talk about when we're talking about the Freedmen's Bureau is you can't necessarily just jump into the collection, especially if you have a goal of using it to help break down a brick wall or perhaps trace your ancestors while they were enslaved. And the reason why we can't necessarily do that is because there's a certain amount of research that has to take place in order for you to be able to jump in and meaningfully use the collection. So let's get clear on where we're at in our research efforts. Okay. Does this mean that we won't ever be able to use the Bureau? No, doesn't mean that. What it means is that when we're approaching it and we're approaching research within the collection, we're very clear and honest about what efforts we've done in order to get us as close to the dates of the collection as possible. So the first question I have for those of you who are watching live, as well as those who are watching the recording is, have you traced your family from present back to 1880, 1870, or even 1865? That's the first question. Use the chat. Several of you are answering yes. And the reason why if you've ever seen me do this presentation before, I've moved the goalpost a little bit on this is because there are some of us who can't get earlier than the 1880 census. We've tried our absolute best. We've looked everywhere. We've pulled every record. We've done all kinds of stuff, but we're unable to actually get further back than the 1880 census. Now, There are some of us who have been lucky enough to be able to trace our ancestors back to the 1870 census, which for most times when you're talking about African American genealogy and family history research, 1870 is your North Star. You are really trying to get back to that census because it is the first one that we have that, in theory, right, counted all Black people in the United States, regardless of their free or formerly enslaved status 5 years prior in 1865. So that's our North Star to try and get back to 1870. But there are some of us who have the ability to get back to 1865. And that could be because we may be living in a state or be researching a state that had records for newly emancipated people, things like births or tax records or all kinds of stuff that qualified our ancestors soon, like or right after the Civil War was over. And so again, your goal is to try to get back to 1880. And if not, your goal is you try to get back to 1870. If not that, 1865. You want to get as close to 1865 as possible because that will help give you the place and the time and the the location, the who your ancestors were in business with, dealing with, who was in their community. It'll help qualify them in a way that'll help you be able to search through the Bureau and to be able to decipher whether or not the person that you found a record for is in fact your ancestor. All right. So, first question is there. Second question, have you confirmed that your ancestors were enslaved or free? This might sound a little weird to ask this during a Freedmen's Bureau presentation, but we have to qualify this in a particular way. Why? Well, a lot of folks make the assumption that their ancestors were enslaved when the Civil War took place and they were freed as a result of the 13th Amendment, right? Or when slavery was abolished, or they were freed as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation because their ancestors were in an insurrectionary state or a state that sided with the Confederacy. A lot of folks make that assumption, and sometimes that's actually not the case. Their ancestors were either emancipated, meaning they were freed by law, or they were manumitted, which is through a private act, like their slaveholder gave them their freedom upon their death, or the slaveholder went to the courthouse and had their freedom recorded at the courthouse. A lot of folks make the assumption that their ancestors were enslaved when the war ended, and that was actually not the case. If they do the due diligence of searching for family members in 1860 on the U.S. Census or even 1850 on the U.S. Census, they will find their family listed as Black, mulatto, the terms that were used at the time, and they are listed on the census. And if they are listed by name on the census, not the slave schedules, that's different. If they're listed on the census at that time, they were free. And you have to remember, 10% of the population of Black folks living in the United States prior to the Civil War were free. So if there were about 4 million enslaved people in 1860, that means that there were about 400,000 free people of color living within the United States. Right. Okay, so great comments here. People saying, yes, their ancestors were enslaved on both sides. How can I confirm? Again, you can confirm with looking at the census prior to 1870. If your folks were on 1870, great. Look on 1860 in the exact same location. Do you find their names on 1860? And do they have a race marked? Because usually on 1860, and this is not always the case, but in most locations, they typically only would mark the race if the person was Black or mulatto. They would put a B or they would put an M for them. Everyone else who was white would be left blank. If you see them in a slave state, or even in a northern location, and they are on the 1860 census, and it's the same exact household from 1870, or you know it's the right people because of names or other research you have, then that means that your ancestors were free. That's how you know. All right. Now, last question. What oral history do you have? Some of us have great oral history about what was going on in the lives of our ancestors. Some of us know or have family land where the land was with my family. I have an uncle, and I actually talked about this in one of the first sessions that I did on African American research, researching your enslaved ancestors, where I talked about how my great great uncle purchased part of the land that was the land that we were enslaved on. And my aunt had given me that story. She had told me, I asked her, well, where was the plantation? Like, where were we enslaved? And she said, we bought the land. We owned the land. And at first, I thought that she was talking about her father, my great grandfather. But no, she was talking about her uncle. Her uncle had purchased that land. And had I followed the lead through him, I would have discovered that. So that's one piece of oral history. Some may have that your ancestors worked for a particular family. Maybe they sharecropped for them. Maybe your ancestor worked in the home of a particular family, or several generations of people worked for a particular family. Maybe you have that oral history, or maybe you have the oral history of we were owned by this particular person. And so, as you're going through your genealogical journey, making sure that you're doing it in the way that you're supposed to, which is starting from now and then tracing back through the generations with records, with oral history, with what you have in your respective home archive. And you're getting back as far as possible. And then that's when you bring in some of those clues. Is, we were enslaved by the kings, right? I'm just giving this name. And the only king family in that particular county or parish is this one particular one. So now I'm going to look for my ancestors' connections to those people through wills, probates, Freedmen's Bureau records, all of that kind of stuff. There's some great stories being shared in the chat. And unfortunately, folks said I didn't listen to the folks on my own particular side of the family, so I missed the stories. Oh, that makes me so sad. Ancestor escaped from a slave owner in Maryland in 1862. Mother was adopted. I've had to build everything I know. Trust me, I understand that. Almost none oral history, plenty of oral history. Everyone's got a wide swath of stuff. But at the end of the day, especially when you're encountering the Freedmen's Bureau, again, a lot of these things that I'm asking questions about factor into how you search and who you search for in this respective collection. So thanks for staying around for this much. You all are doing great. Again, the fact that you're even able to answer these questions at this point in your genealogical journey means that you have started off the way that you're supposed to. And if not, they are a great way to kind of bring you back to center and give you a good foundation so that you can factor these things in as you're searching. Because, especially being someone who is African American, who has wanted to trace the family of or trace my ancestors as far back as I possibly can, I'm gonna encounter enslavement. I don't have a choice. I'm gonna encounter that. And in order for me to learn how to work around that system and the challenges that we face as a result of how the system operated and how things were documented and all of that, I have to put my best foot forward. And in doing so, I have to be able to answer these types of things so that I can make the most concerted effort or director pointed effort for me to get the information that I'm seeking. All right. So great question. Someone says, I think my family were slaves of a Murray family. How do I confirm this? Well, the Freedmen's Bureau is one of the ways that you can do that, especially if your family was in a state where the Bureau operated and there are a number of records available. It's a resource, just like the last session I did on articles of enslavement that documented auctions and runaway slave ads within the United States as documented in newspapers. That is a collection that you can use to potentially get the confirmation that you need. Same thing for this. There is no one size fits all to validate enslavement of your ancestors. And I have to stop screen sharing because I have to tell you all this directly. There is no one size fits all for researching enslavement in the United States and validating that an ancestor was enslaved by a particular family. There are tips and tricks and shortcuts that we could potentially use, things like we're talking about, like the Freedmen's Bureau, things like wills and probates, things like slave lists, or some of the collections we have like Virginia Untold that document the enslaved. But there is no one size fits all. And the sooner you absorb that and you process that and you allow yourself to be open towards whatever sources there are to try to validate your claim, the faster and the more adept at this you're going to get. But if you want there to be a magic bullet, sorry, there isn't one, because every scenario is different. Every state is different. And when one thing may work well for Nika, it might not work well for you. So I'm telling you this emphatically from the bottom of my heart. Resources are the most important thing. And as you gather them and you learn them, that is what makes you able to bust through some of this stuff. And for some people, it goes very quickly. And for others, it takes a while. Right. Sounds like we have to create the bullet. Right. That's a very fair assessment. All right. So let's get back to our slides. Okay. Let's go behind the operation. Okay, so when we're talking about the Freedmen's Bureau, we've got to properly qualify what in the world we're talking about. And we also have to understand how it was organized. This is very, very, very important because we're talking about federal records. We're talking about a federal entity. This is not a state entity. The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands is not a state entity. It was federal, meaning that the records are federal and they are kept in a way that is very similar to how military records were kept because of the establishment of the Bureau under the War Department. So the official name is the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. Okay, that's the official name of the Freedmen's Bureau. We truncate it to the Freedmen's Bureau. The difference is you may have heard about the Freedmen's Bank. I had the great opportunity yesterday to talk with the author of a book called Savings and Trust, Dr. Justine Hill Edwards, who she has an incredible book that's just out that talks about the Freedmen's Bank. But the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Bank are two different entities. Two different, okay? Freedmen, freed man. That's how you know the difference between the two. The man got the bank, the men got the bureau. Maybe you'll hear that in your mind as you start researching through the records. Okay. The man got the bank, the men got the bureau. It's not a typo. Again, the man got the bank, the men got the bureau. Does the bureau have Freedmen's hospital records? Yes. It does. We're going to talk about all of that. Some of you all are like eager and excited. I love it. Keep that energy. Keep that energy. Now, records for both the Freedmen's Bank and the Freedmen's Bureau are within the collection at Ancestry, but you can also still search them separately. I'll show you this when we get to the practical part where we're live on the site and you're watching me do this particular research. Okay. Now, the bank was established by the War Department on March 3rd of 1865. Okay, and you're going to see so many similarities between the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Bank because some of the officials were officials across both. They had roles in both. Okay, so that's why there's a lot of crossover. You'll see names repeated for officials and all of that kind of stuff. Operations in some locations for the Freedmen's Bureau began as early as 1863. So we're talking about during the Civil War. A lot of folks think about the Bureau and they're like, oh, okay, it's after the war ended. No, there are some locations in particular, Virginia, Louisiana, parts of Tennessee, where you are finding records that are called pre-Bureau records or Freedmen's Department records that are within the Bureau that actually are before the war is over. So there's a possibility, depending on where your ancestor lived during this time period, that you may actually find them documented in the Bureau before they're actually emancipated or before they're actually free. They're actually likely, maybe potentially still enslaved and being mentioned in these records. I found my family that way. Now, the Bureau officially closed operations in 1872, but because of some of the duties that they had, they could not literally just sever ties and call it a day. There was still business that needed to be handled. And so what they started to do is because of the way that the Bureau was created and operated, they would, close down local offices and then all the business that was there would get shifted to like sort of a regional center. And then those regional centers operated until they closed down more business. And then what they had left then got, kind of triaged to another part of the US government. What state-specific bureau have its own name? Well, we're going to get to all of that in a second. Look at you guys being eager. Now let's talk about what was the auspices of the Freedmen's Bureau. What were they charged to do? All matters relating to refugees. And for some of you, this may be a surprise seeing because you've seen that term. You might have made an assumption that the refugees were black. No, the refugees were poor white people. So even in the name of the Bureau, folks have made it a collection for black people. No. Mm-mm. In fact, I don't think that there's a single collection of records on black folks that I'm aware of that don't have other people of other ethnicities in them. Not if they're federal. I don't think that that's the case because it's America. We're all coexisting together. And so with the Bureau, right? If it's federal, it's a federal entity, it's the Bureau of Refugees who are poor whites. And technically, you could even potentially qualify free people of color under that. But it was meant for poor whites, freedmen, right? Who are the formerly enslaved, okay? And the abandoned land. What is abandoned land? Abandoned land is the land, the thousands of acres of land within insurrectionary states that had just been left because of the Confederates, right? Like some people just abandoned their land, and literally there's thousands of acres of land that had crops and things on them that needed to be processed. Otherwise, it was going to kill the U.S. economy. Or again, where are all these people who are working this land? Where are they? What's going to happen if the owner of the land is gone and abandoned it? So that's where you get the title from. Okay. So all matters relating to refugees, freedmen, and abandoned land, just property, abandoned or seized or confiscated land. Okay. Now the Freedmen's Bureau was over labor contracts. This is probably the biggest thing that most of you have heard of. And what is a labor contract? After slavery ended, again, Freedmen's Bureau comes down. It's there. Their function was to essentially help move slaveholder and enslaved to employer and employee. If you go back and even to an earlier session that I did on Juneteenth and talking about the special order that was given by General Gordon Granger, it specifically references the Freedmen's Bureau and the relationship going from enslaver and enslaved to employer and employee. The labor contract is the means by which that relationship change happened. The Bureau was responsible for making sure that the former slaveholder or potential now employer was now compensating their formerly enslaved or their now employee. That's what the contract was for labor. Okay. So in addition to being over the actual contract signing and keeping the contract, the Bureau was over disputes and complaints about contracts and contract terms. The Bureau was also over apprenticeships. Many people hear that term and they think back to early America and people apprenticing themselves, coming over to a new land and all of that. That didn't just end in that time period. The Freedmen's Bureau was over people who were poor, could not afford to take care of their children, or even orphan children were apprenticed out. And in some states, the former slaveholder was given first preference on being the person that the child was apprenticed to. And so in addition to those apprenticeship agreements and contracts, the Bureau was over disputes and complaints regarding those things. More duties, relief programs, rations and clothing, hospitals, contraband, and refugee camps. You're thinking contraband? What do you mean? Well, the enslaved were technically contraband. And when they would come in contact with Union troops, especially the U.S. colored troops, when they would see other Black people in service to the United States fighting this war and fighting for their freedom, oftentimes they would leave their plantations or where they were enslaved and start to follow the Union troops. And then these camps started to pop up that would be close to where the troops were, where there would be wide swaths of enslaved people who just wanted to be close to the Union because they knew, they were hoping that this was, was ensuring their freedom. And so you have contraband camps pop up all over the U.S. In fact, there was one not far from where I'm sitting actually right now. And the roots of that community that's still there, a lot of those folks had ancestors who were in that contraband camp today. Isn't that crazy? Hospitals, Well-known hospitals. In fact, Howard University Hospital was a Freedmen's Bureau hospital. Um, a lot of things people don't even think about that are connected back to the Bureau that still exist in our world today that we are still, people are still using, people are still engaging with. Schools. You want to talk about Howard University? Howard University was started as a Freedmen's Bureau school. In fact, Howard is named after General O. Howard, Oliver Otis Howard, or Otis Howard, who was the commissioner, right, of the Freedmen's Bureau, the person who nationally was over the Freedmen's Bureau. Howard University is named after him. Right. Hospital at Howard was named Freedman Hospital. Yes. There's someone actually here live who was born at Freedman's Hospital in Washington, D.C. What a cool fact. That's pretty awesome. Okay. So as you can see, the Freedmen's Bureau, again, we're not even done with all of the functions. They did marriages or gave permission for people to marry other folks. Why is this important? There were certain states where when slavery ended, they enacted laws that said, or even had it before, that single men and women couldn't live together. And in order for you to live together, in that way, you had to be married. So many of these folks had to go and get marriage licenses. And so, again, you'll find marriage licenses within the Bureau. You'll also find correspondence and documentation of people being given permission to marry other individuals. Transportation. This is another one that I think a lot of folks don't pay attention to as well. We often think, let's say your ancestor is found in Texas in 1870 and they have a birth location of South Carolina. And you make an assumption that they were brought to Texas as a result of enslavement. Their slaveholder left South Carolina and brought them to Texas. When in reality, you might find transportation records within the Freedmen's Bureau that document your ancestor being taken from Kingstree, South Carolina to Texas after slavery was ended or had ended because there was a shortage of people to work the land. And in a lot of locations, the Freedmen's Bureau was paying for the newly emancipated to be taken from one location to the next so that they could work the land. They could work all this abandoned land. And that example that I just gave is not one that I pulled out of the sky. There actually was a group of people who were in Kingstree. There's someone here who is a descendant of those folks who were taken from Kingstree, South Carolina to Texas. And it's all documented. The list of all the people that were taken was in the Freedmen's Bureau. It was there. So it wasn't slavery that brought them there. It was the Freedmen's Bureau that brought them there. Now, military. You're probably thinking, how in the world did they manage to do all this stuff? But they did. Military, they were over bounty payments and back pay to the U.S. colored troops. More than 180,000 Black men. And we also have to qualify the scores of Black women who served as nurses and matrons and all sorts of roles like that to aid the colored troops within the Civil War effort. Again, they were over the U.S. colored troops for a while. Back pay, pensions, right? Bounty payments. You have to think about the Compensation Act, how Black soldiers were not paid the same as white soldiers with the same rank when the war started. And it wasn't until 1865 that legislation was passed to ensure that Black soldiers of the same rank of white soldiers were paid the same. So they had to have somebody issue all that back pay. Where do you think those records are? Right. More complaints and detailed reports on race relations and violence. There is a whole section of information within the Bureau, depending on the state. I know Louisiana is very deep with this. Same thing with Virginia, that documents what was going on between the races. The district commissioners or sub-assistant commissioners, the assistant commissioners, they would often give these reports and they would be writing to the National Freedmen's Bureau talking about what was going on and what the conditions were like between the races. And so you will find some very, very hard stuff to read when you're going through that section of the Bureau records. Again, have to call out that it is there. And the other thing I also want to point out too, and not so much aligned to that specific point, is the Bureau officials were largely white. So just like how we have, poor whites who could benefit from the services of the Bureau, we also have to realize that white folks, in particular white men, in particular Union Army folks, military folks, they were serving in the leadership roles of the Bureau. So don't just think that, again, it's a collection that's just for Black folks or just with Black people in it. There are poor whites, and again, the folks who were working at the Bureau, who were donating to the schools, who were doing all that, a lot of times they could be free people of color or they could be white. Um, let's see, there's a good question in the chat right now. Does the Freedmen's Bureau have records of refugees or contraband from Gullah Wars and Seminole Wars? Again, you have to qualify or quantify the time period with which you're looking. And not, I can't answer that off the top of my head, but it may behoove you to try to see and search if you can find something in the collection. Can all this information be found on Ancestry, or do we have to go someplace in our state and access the full Freedmen's Bureau? No. It's on Ancestry. Now, here's my beautiful map. These are the states of operation that have the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay. And literally, it's mostly the southern part of the United States. Now, if we're talking state by state, Virginia, which also includes West Virginia became a state during the war. Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, District of Columbia, or DC, along with Alabama, Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and Florida. And that Delaware may surprise some of you because you're like, wait a minute, Delaware wasn't a slave state. Absolutely, Delaware was a slave state. It was. Yes, the Freedmen's Bureau is free to access. Absolutely. Searching and viewing the images is free to access. Is there any records in the Cherokee Nation on the slaves the Indians kept? Yes, there are some records, and those are wrapped in with Arkansas. If you have ancestors who were in a location where the Bureau itself did not operate, but there was an office close to where your folks were, they may have traveled to get services in that near location. So if we're talking Cherokee Nation in particular, they're going to Fort Smith because there was a field office for the Freedmen's Bureau in Fort Smith. So yes, that's the question. Dawes rolls are not going to have anything about the Freedmen's Bureau. That's a separate time. That's a separate process. Now, with regard to Gullah Wars and Seminole Wars, based on what someone put in the chat, that predates the Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen's Bureau, again, 1865, as early as 1863, records going all the way to 1878. If I have family in Virginia, should I look in West Virginia too? You're going to literally be in Virginia. You're going to stay rooted in Virginia because the West Virginia counties that, that came out of Virginia, they have the exact same names as the names that they had when they were a part of Virginia. All right. So let's go back old school a little bit. We're going to talk about representation within the collection, okay? Because some of you may be looking to see, is my state represented? How many records are there? Okay. Now, to qualify everything, I need you to understand that the Freedmen's Bureau, when they came to get the records and to move them to the National Archives, it was chaotic. Okay. Stuff was all over the place. So the organization that we have the Bureau right now in terms of how the records are is the best with which the National Archives could do because a lot of this stuff was chaotic. I should have included that newspaper article that talked about how stuff was kind of strewn all over the place. But if you're researching again, in a place like Virginia, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, and Kentucky, you should be in the Freedmen's Bureau because you have the most records compared to other locations. And if we look at the total number of rolls of microfilm that make up the Freedmen's Bureau, it's actually more than the 1860 census for the whole US. It's not far under the 1870 census for the whole US. And it's more rolls of microfilm than the 1880 census for the US. So why are we not using this as a resource if it's that voluminous? And so, yeah, again, just want to qualify how big this collection is. And in particular, again, if you have a state that you're researching that is on this list that has representation in the Bureau, you should be searching. Some states don't have education records broken out into their own subset. They may be folded in with the state or field office records. So I just want to qualify that. So if you see 0 there, that doesn't mean that there's no education records. It just means that it may have been folded into another part of the respective collection. Yes, this is an American database. Right. All right. So, hierarchy. Probably the most important thing besides what the Bureau did that you need to know. Okay. Why? Because your focus should initially be on the field office level. And that is important. Okay. So, when we're talking about hierarchy, at the very top is the national headquarters. That's where General O.O. Howard was presiding over the National Freedmen's Bureau. Okay, so anything that happened at the levels below was going up the chain to the national headquarters in Washington, D.C. Then underneath that is where you have the assistant commissioners. And those are by the state. So every state had a different assistant commissioner. There are some cases where an assistant commissioner was serving for two states at one time. In particular, you have Kentucky and Tennessee, where I found records for Kentucky rolled in with Tennessee because they had the same assistant commissioner. So again, you gotta kind of think broadly and definitely fluidly when you're talking about the Bureau, because again, this is the best organization we could potentially get. Okay. So you've got national, you've got state. Then within certain states, you have sub-assistant commissioners. And those are particular counties within that state or parishes within that state that are broken up into districts. This is the case that happened, especially in Louisiana. We had sub-assistant commissioners and we had districts within the state. Those then would report to the state person who was the assistant commissioner, and then the state commissioner would report to the national. Then you have the field offices. And this is where you're going to find all sorts of things from letters. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff in the Bureau records. Like I can't even fully quantify it and tell you every state has this. No, every state does not have everything. But the cities and the towns that made up the field offices, again, they will report up to the sub-assistant or the district person if that existed in that state, or they would be reporting to the assistant commissioner at the state level, who would then report to Washington, D.C. The reason why I'm laying this out is important. It's because let's say records from your field office did not survive, but the records for the assistant commissioner did for the state. This means that you might find stuff in there that you don't find in the field office, and vice versa. And there's a possibility if the issue was of a certain size, you may actually find the records for that at national. Okay. So let's say they didn't survive the state level and they didn't survive the field. You might find them at the national level and vice versa. Okay. So I'm going to touch briefly before I literally go into searching on the bank. I think it's important because these records are wrapped into the actual Bureau records, but again, they're in a separate collection. Now, Freedmen's Bank, again, man got the bank, men got the Bureau. Okay, I talked about that earlier. Official name of this is the Freedmen Savings and Trust Company. It was separate from the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay, again, but both records are within U.S. Freedmen's Bureau records spanning from 1865 to 1878. These records are also in with the Freedmen's Bank collection that goes from 1865 to 1874. This was established by Congress same exact day. That's why there's the conflation, or people get them confused. March 3rd of 1865. Operations began earlier, same as the pre-Bureau records that I talked about. We have a similar situation with the bank where you get some locations like Beaufort, South Carolina, Norfolk, Virginia, and New Orleans, where the seeds of the bank began as a result of military savings banks, being Black men who were in the Union Army who need a place to store their money. They started these military savings banks. All right, closed operations in 1874. So we have 4-year variance between when the Bureau stopped and when the bank stopped. Now, there is way more coverage in the bank than there is the Bureau. Okay. And I'm going to lay out some of the locations very quickly. Notice how we've added more northern states to this than we had previous. Okay. So let's start with the locations that had, or states that had at least 3 branches. Georgia had at least 3 branches. We have one in Atlanta, Augusta, and Savannah. Virginia had 3 locations, Lynchburg, Norfolk, and Richmond. Mississippi had 3 locations, Columbus, Vicksburg, and Natchez. North Carolina had three locations with New Bern, Raleigh, and Wilmington. So just like with the Bureau, if you're not using that, you're not using the Bureau, and you're researching in Louisiana, Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, all those states that I named off, if you're not looking through the Freedmen's Bank records and you're researching Georgia, Virginia, Mississippi, or North Carolina, you might be missing the mark, especially if your ancestors lived in and around these respective areas. Now, locations that have two branches include Huntsville and Mobile, Alabama, Lexington and Louisville, Kentucky, New Orleans and Shreveport in Louisiana. Memphis had two, one in Memphis and in Nashville. South Carolina had Beaufort and Charleston. And then we've got these other hodgepodge of locations, which include Little Rock, Washington, D.C., Tallahassee, Florida, St. Louis, Missouri, Baltimore, Maryland, New York, New York, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The headquarters of the bank was in New York, but then they moved it to Washington, D.C. The actual building is still there in Washington, D.C. Okay. All right. I know I've covered quite a bit, but I know you want me to get to the searching. You want to know what you can find in this respective collection. We're going to make sure that we make the links available to you all so that you have the ability to, again, to search live with me as I'm doing this. Um, and let's see. All right. So we are here on the Freedmen's Bureau Records page. As always, I want to point out to you all something in particular. If you are questioning whether or not there is coverage for your respective area, what the collection is made up of, always make sure that when you're on the collection page, you scroll down to the About the Collection. Okay? Always scroll down to that because it's going to tell you what is in there. If you are missing that step, please, 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 especially if something is new that came out and you may not necessarily be finding your ancestors in the collection and you don't understand why because they were living in a place at a particular time, make sure that you are going down to the collecting description. And when you're looking through this, we have general information, but also notice here, we're telling you that the bank records are included within this collection. Okay. Now, there's also links to other things that are here, along with all the sources and all that stuff. Okay. You can also browse. Notice here, okay, we've got the field offices, the headquarters records, and let me zoom in a little bit more so you can see these. Headquarters, right? That's the commissioner, right? Field offices at the bottom of the total poll. Records of the assistant commissioner. We know that that's based on the state. Okay. Then you've got state records of the superintendent of education. Now, let's just choose a location or a name to search for. Okay. We can find all kinds of things. Let's put in Asbury Lee. Million people with this name. Now, let's see. Asbury Lee, we've got a resident, location of Texas. My suggestion for searching through the Freedmen's Bureau is to start local and then move out. You don't necessarily, and what I mean by local is don't drill down and say, can you find Asbury Lee living in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma? Now that's a bad example because there was no Freedmen's Bureau in Broken Arrow. But I'm saying you would look for Oklahoma as opposed to Broken Arrow. That's my suggestion. Start state, then radiate out, or just start, or maybe even look by name. Okay. So with that, let's see, we got a few records. Notice I use my wildcard search here because the name Asbury could be spelled a number of different ways. It could be Asberry. It could be Asbury. It could be a number of things. And you see here, when you look here on the results I got for using that asterisk, it did qualify. It did produce results for that. So I've got Asbury, Asberry, and then I've got Asbury. And let's pick this one that doesn't have a date or a location. Now, breadcrumbs, super important, okay? This is good for you to know. Do I always begin with a wildcard search? Great question. Sometimes yes, depending on the name. If I know the name is going to be butchered, I might start my search with a wild card just because, again, Many of my ancestors were at the mercy of other people to document them, which meant that their names could be butchered all kinds of ways. So generally, I do. So breadcrumbs, super important. What do I mean by breadcrumbs? Look here at the very top of this page, okay? Breadcrumbs will tell you what part of the Bureau records you're in. So that's why I mentioned to you about the hierarchy, and it's important. So we've got letters and telegrams sent. This is all M1027, and then it's telling me this is in records of the assistant commissioner. So this is telling me these are state level records for the state of Louisiana, not the field office. This isn't local. This is for state level. Okay. So we're going to come in here and look and see what we're going to find. So this looks like a register of letters. And I know this is a register because it told me at the top, right, of the page. It said that. It said it was letters. And it said it was letters received. Okay. And it says from the claim division, headquarters, refugees, freedmen, and abandoned lands. That's what the RF and A stands for. New Orleans, August 3rd of 1868, claim division. Agent in charge, Bureau of RF and A lands, Washington, D.C. So this is correspondence that's being interacted between the state level official in Louisiana and the national headquarters of the Freedmen's Bureau. It says, sir, I have the honor to acknowledge and receipt communication number 1484 from your office enclosing discharges of the following named men, late of the 47th USC troops. That means late 47th Infantry, 47th Infantry of the U.S. Colored Troop. That's what USC. What are RS and A lands again? Refugees, freedmen, and abandoned lands. That's a long title. These folks, again, we're talking pen and ink. We are not talking texting. We're not even talking really typing, okay? Folks had pen and ink, so they did not feel like writing Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands every time. So get used to that acronym because you're going to see it a lot. You'll also see USC for U.S. Colored Troops, USCT. So these are claims for bounty that have been allowed for the amount set opposite their respective names. So Asbury Lee, who is a private in Company B of the U.S. Colored Troops 47th Regiment, is getting a $252 bounty payment. Right. Along with other folks who are in different companies, right? So it looks like, actually, no, everybody's in Company B. We've got Henry Maxley, Nelson Owen, Asbury Lee, Charles Johnson, and Samuel King. They're all getting $252. Why do they get a bounty? Okay, bounty is for enlisting and in service of their service for the U.S. Colored Troops, right? It is essentially, it's enlistment. It's like a sign-on bonus. And this was a lot of money at this time. So what would I do if I got this record? Well, number one, this is telling me that these people are in the U.S. Colored Troops. It's telling me that they fought in behalf of the Civil War, right? They fought on the side of the Union. It's telling me that they got a land bounty, or not land bounty. It tells me that they got a bounty. I said and slipped and said land bounty because when you're looking at earlier wars like Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Mexican-American War, one of the ways that they gave bounties instead of amounts of money is they gave land instead. So in this instance, these veterans are getting a bounty payment of $252. Where I'm going from this is I'm looking to see if these individuals filed for a pension as a result of their service. I'm trying to find them on the 1870 census, perhaps in Louisiana, right? I'm looking to see if they lived long enough to make it to 1910 census, 1920 census, where it asks if they were a veteran of the late war. That would confirm that I have the right person. That's in the column on the far right-hand side of that census. I'm going to see if I can find them in any other records in the Bureau, maybe even the bank. So we'll save this page. And then writing in cursive is better than the writing Tennessee records. It's hard to read. Yeah, it depends on what you're looking for, guys. Unfortunately, the only way to learn how to read handwriting better is to keep reading more handwriting. Hate to say that, but it's just the truth. All right, so these records are in Texas. Note, these are registers of complaints. Again, look at the breadcrumbs. This is in Waco, and it's at the field office level. So we're at the local level in the Bureau. And we are going to look for an Asbury Lee. Here goes our record here. Why are enslavers listed in the Freedmen records? Well, it all depends. In some instances, I've seen lists of people who are applying for rations or relief. And in order for people to properly qualify who individuals were, you could have two people named Nancy or one person named John and the other one named John, and they came from two different slaveholders. They could delineate between the two by listing who the slaveholder was. So there's a number of different reasons. You'll find lists of enslaved people with their slaveholders. You'll find them without. I mean, it's kind of all over the place. So this Asbury Lee versus John Iglehart. This is number 70, May of 18, maybe 66 or 1867 or 68, one of the two. That Englehart owes him $14.75 for labor. Here's an example of a dispute over a labor contract. And then we've got some writing over this. I affirm immediately or approve immediately, appeared and granted on account of 125. Oh, Lord, something stolen, Lord. And something cash paid, postponed over. Oh, Lord, Texas is draining all my blood out of me to read this today. What I would do from here is I would research the connection between an Asbury Lee and a John Iglehart. In fact, I might actually go over back to the Bureau and search for John Iglehart to see if he's on a labor contract. Is there a document in the Freedmen's Bureau which provides the standard pay for men, women, and elderly? Not that I've seen. I think it all depends on where they were and the amount of resources that they were giving out. Yeah, I don't think that they're, I mean, considering that it's the military, there usually is like one standard and then they apply it everywhere. But that might be something that you might have to browse to find where there's like the order, that comes down from national. And then that's where again, this is how you would go up the chain to research. So if you see a payment disbursement coming out at a field office, then you can go up the chain at the state level or at the national level to see the edict or the order or the letter that was sent that designated how much money people would get. What's the best way to record this information in my tree? Well, if we're talking for Asbury Lee, who was over here, you can go down here at the bottom and then again, he's because it's indexed. Let me refresh this. Oh, I don't know why that's not popping up. You can save the record. So come up to here, save to your tree. What are the DOS roles and what do they tell us? Okay, so DAWS roles completely separate from this. It's not DOS, it's DAWES. Those are roles that were created by the federal government to disperse land that was in states such as Oklahoma that were not a state at the time. The Dawes Act, by virtue of it being passed, is what helped usher Oklahoma into becoming a state in 1907. Because federally recognized tribes like the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole nations held land in common, they had to equally disperse the land so that when the state became a state, everyone was given equal land, especially if they had right and title as a citizen of those respective nations. So those Dawes rolls document that, and the Dawes rolls are actually what the nations use to validate the ability for people to get citizenship today. Totally separate issue, but sort of aligned a little bit. All right, so we learned how to search. We learned how to get to records. Again, you can browse, you can search by name. Again, start maybe at the state level, then go into the record to see what the details are and if you can qualify whether or not it's your ancestor or not. Again, I searched for John Iglehart within this particular collection and I only find him mentioned here. I would then go to the 1870 census, 1860 census, 1860 slave schedules to see if John Iglehart was a slaveholder in Texas and where, how many enslaved people he had. And then I would try to track down to see if that Asbury Lee that filed the complaint against him was actually one of his formerly enslaved. You see how this is a lead? Sometimes in these instances, it's going to be a lead to take you somewhere else. And in others, it's going to give you the answer that you want. Okay. All right. So, with that said, we only have a few minutes left, and I want to also make sure that I get to any questions that haven't been answered. Um, with regard to the Freedmen's Bank records, I'm going to put a name in here that I know I can find a record for. Now, remember, bank, bureau, man has the bank, men has the bureau. Okay. These records are awesome. Okay. So let's look at this with the deposit information or with the account opening information with these. This is probably, again, some of the most incredible information you can find. For this record for Jeremiah Wilson Bowers, not only do we have the date that he opened his account, where he was born, where he was living. So he was born in Philadelphia, but he was living in Brooklyn. He's age 52 next August. So it's giving you a date of when he's turning 52. His complexion, his occupation, which is a caterer, the fact that he's married to a woman named Elizabeth. They have two children, Kate and Ada. And here's what I want to zoom in on. His father's name is John Bowers. He's dead. His wife or his mother is named Henrietta. She's dead as of 1871. So now we've got a confirmation of death for the parents of this person opening the account. We know his name, where he was born, who he's married to, who his two children are. We also get the names of his siblings. Note that it says his sister Hannah is the widow of Henry Miller. His sister Henrietta is the widow of Francis Duterte, and that they're in Philadelphia, and that he has a sister named Sarah in New York. All of these family connections just based off of opening account with the Freedmen's Bank. So where do you go from here? I would look in 1870 census. I'd want to find him with his wife, Elizabeth, and his two daughters. I would also try to find his siblings on the 1870 census. How is it that this man, again, to confirm whether he's black or white, because there are white folks that had accounts with the Freedmen's Bank. Once I confirmed that he was black, which I know that he was, how was he born how was he born before 1871? Obviously in Philadelphia. This to me indicates that he likely was free. Right. Lots and lots and lots and lots of leads. Okay. Did I mention what the papers regarding complaints? Again, complaints regarding apprenticeships, labor contracts, race relations. There are a number of different ways of complaints that could be in the Bureau. Let's see, more Q&A since we have a couple minutes left. Okay, so we got some folks typing some answers. So let me get to the ones there. Thank you. Still challenged with the common name Brown. Oh yeah, Godspeed to you, because I have a grandparent with the name Brown. And his name is James Brown at that. I'm in your world. I found my great-great-grandmother listed in a Freedmen's Register receiving $1. Will there be any further records to look for in the Freedmen's records with more details than just her name and address regarding this entry in the register? Yes. Again, go up the chain. Remember I mentioned, so, where did you find that record? Was it at the field office? If it was at the field office, then I would go the next level and start looking at the state level records for the assistant commissioner. Or if you have a state that was broken down into districts, I would look at the district records, because 9 times out of 10, they're probably going to tell you, about this indigent woman who needs rations or relief, and they had to secure it for her. They're going to mention her in that respective way. All right. I know my mother was born in Virginia in a particular date. Would get to know my grandparents' name and where do I look in Virginia? Last name is Laughlin. Start with yourself and go back through the generations you're using, census records, birth, marriage, and death to qualify and confirm that you have the right information. Always go back to our beginning genealogy session. It will help guide you on how to start the process in order to trace back to get close enough to what we're talking about now. Have there or will there be trainings regarding Dawes in Oklahoma? If you want us to talk more about the Dawes rolls, as usual, as I always tell you all, put it in the chat. Let us know. Again, just like how we're going to have another session where we're going to have a follow-up to articles of enslavement, where I show you those articles that I found in our live session. And I'm going to take that information and go to try and find additional information on those people and the folks who were mentioned. You can also set the course if you want us to have something for the Dawes rolls or researching the five tribes. Use the chat and say yes. Comment on the recording of this video and say yes. That's how you get the sessions that you want and that you need. All right. Thank you so much, you all, for joining today. It's been wonderful to be here with you to talk about the Freedmen's Bureau. Again, if you have questions, if you start making finds, all of that, be sure to comment below the recording of the video. And our team will attempt to answer your questions. Have a great day. Bye bye.